Subcommittee will come to order, and good morning and welcome everyone. And I thank you for being here for this very, very timely and I think very important hearing. The Jewish people have survived and thrived from the times of biblical antiquity to the present day. Quite a feat when you consider all of the civilizations that have come and gone. The Hittites, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, Persians, Greece, Rome. The presence of Jews has enriched the cultures of many civilizations and countries, from the Americas to Ethiopia to China. But just as the Jewish people have endured so much, so too has anti-Semitic hatred. This hatred has ranged from prejudiced slurs whispered in private to the murder of more than 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. 72 years after the Holocaust ended, anti-Semites continued to target the Jewish people for discrimination, destruction of property, and even death. This hearing will explore global threats to Jewish communities, the underlying ideologies, and what actions the United States and other countries and international organizations should take. Our witnesses, including Paul Goldenberg, the National Director of the Secure Community Network, addresses, quote, the current state of affairs in Europe, specifically the increased levels of hate-motivated incidents impacting Jewish communities. Mr. Goldenberg also asked whether perpetrators of both sides of the Atlantic may be feeding each other. He emphasizes that it is vital that the Congress and the U.S. government identify, analyze, and respond to the cross-Atlantic links between anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic remarks. I convene this hearing so that we can ensure that we are scrutinizing the cross-Atlantic connections and the solutions. Our second witness, Rabbi Andy Baker, a friend for decades and personal representative of the OSCE co-chair in office on combating anti-Semitism and director of international Jewish affairs for the American Jewish Committee, testifies in his written remarks that after the terrorist attacks in Paris, Brussels, and Copenhagen, quote, no longer were governments able to ignore the situation. They have responded, he cautioned, though that problems still remain. Governments have taken different approaches, and some only in stopgap measures. Rabbi Baker has warned that we need to be clear-eyed in confronting and combating anti-Semitism, which manifests itself on both the right and the left. And I would note parenthetically, as the one who suggested we have an OSCE conference back in the year 2000, and thankfully, Ambassador Menekes, who was our OSCE ambassador at the time, made that dream, working with Andy Baker and a few other leaders, a reality during the Bush administration. Andy was the one who wordsmithed the language that became major parts of it, what we call the Berlin Declaration, which was an action plan for the countries of the OSCE, Canada, the United States, and Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, to combat this pervasive violence against Jews called anti-Semitism. It was a very important and I think remarkable document. It is still in force, although its implementation, and that's one of the things that Rabbi Baker seeks to do as special representative, to talk to countries, their governments, to the NGOs in country, to try to persuade them to be far more proactive than so many of them are. In his written testimony, our third witness, Mark Weitzman, Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, explored a wide range of ideologies and manifestations of anti-Semitism. He flagged that the, quote, regeneration of traditional anti-Semitism is all the more dangerous because unlike the violent extremists of both left and right and radical Islam, it is now found in government circles and halls of power in countries that we define as Western democracies. Pointing to a trend in Europe and the United States, Mr. Weitzman notes that, quote, academic spaces are quickly becoming hotbeds of anti-Semitic bias, with students each year reporting greater discomfort at publicly identifying as Jewish or as supporters of Israel. The great Natan Sharansky has taught us powerfully about the new anti-Semitism which targets the state of Israel. I'll never forget when Natan Sharansky testified at 2 hearings that I chaired, and this is about the 18th or 19th hearing on combating anti-Semitism. He talked about demonization, delegitimization, and the double standard, the 3 Ds, as he called it, of modern-day anti-Semitism, on top of course, the more or the virulent form that we have known for millennia, of targeting Jews, killing Jews, and destroying Jewish cemeteries and all of the rest of the hate manifestation. But Sharansky made an excellent point, and he made it at the Berlin conference, and Rabbi Baker, I'm sure, remembers it well, when he told all of the foreign ministers and everybody was assembled about the 3 Ds. He says, disagree with Israel on a policy, but as soon as you cross that line and the double standard and say they don't have a right to exist, or they get disproportionate focus at the UN Human Rights Council and a number of other UN agencies, when you demonize Israel, as they do so frequently, where's China? Talk about human rights abuse. There's the human rights abuser of the world, not Israel, and yet Israel gets all the attention. And then, of course, this idea of double standard, which is rampant. It is a virus, anti-Semitism, that again causes the UN Human Rights Council to make Israel the only country permanently on its debate agenda, the only country. In this context, I applaud our new permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Nikki Haley, and I have met with Nikki Haley on this very issue, for announcing on Monday that the U.S. will no longer participate in this frenzy of Israel bashing known as Agenda Item Number 7. Instead, she said the United States will only participate to vote against the outrageous, one-sided anti-Israel resolutions that so diminish what the Human Rights Council should be, close quote. The Human Rights Council is also the body that directed the High Commissioner for Human Rights to compile a blacklist of companies working with Israelis beyond the 1949 armistice line, including Jerusalem's Old City, the location of Judaism's holiest site. This measure is self-evidently born out of the anti-Israeli boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, movement that is disturbingly prevalent in many European countries and in college campuses across the United States. I've met with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and raised this issue myself last fall, and said how disappointed, how angry so many of us are that he would misuse his position as High Commissioner to carry on in this way. And, of course, the Human Rights Council is doing it on steroids. Let me also say, before I introduce our witness, I want to also welcome Stacy Burdett from the ADL. Again, another longtime friend and a great leader in combating anti-Semitism. She has also brought a particular focus to Latin America, a much welcomed focus, but for all of your wonderful work, thank you as well for your leadership. I would also like to associate myself with Mr. Weitzman's statement when he put it, fighting anti-Semitism always has been a bipartisan commitment, and in today's fractured political world, it is more necessary than ever that the United States, in its diplomatic and moral leadership, remain on this issue. And I really thank you for that admonishment, which is so important. This has to stay bipartisan because we as Americans have to combat anti-Semitism anytime and anywhere it manifests its ugly face. For as long as I have been a member of Congress, there has been a broad partisan support for combating anti-Semitism. Just for the record, in 1982, in my first trip, Andy Harris now with the AJC, and a number of other important leaders, Mark Levin from the NGS, the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, invited me to go to Moscow and Leningrad for 10 days to meet with refuseniks. And what an eye-opening experience it was to see when there's a state sponsor of anti-Semitism, that is the Soviet Union, and the systematic persecution of Jews in psychiatric prisons, and of course, by making anyone who applied for an exit visa poor by denying them a job, not giving me an exit visa, and then making them poor by denying them any means to provide for their families. And then, of course, prison was commonplace. I visited Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains a few years later. And matter of fact, along with Frank Wolf, we went and videotaped every prisoner we met with. It was at the beginning of Glasnost and Perestroika. And when we showed that to Natan Sharansky, who had just been released, he says, these were all of my friends, and they're still there. And of course, we kept fighting until they got out. This hearing, I hope, this will be the first in a series that our subcommittee will conduct. Our next hearing, we hope to have the special representative when he or she is named. and maybe somebody sitting at this very witness table, to be the special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. For the record, back in 2004, I'm the one who offered the amendment to create it. It's a statutory position. And I, along with the other co-chairs of the Anti-Semitism Caucus, have done a joint letter asking that the administration name that person now. And earlier this week, in a meeting with Vice President Pence, not only did I raise this issue, but gave him a letter asking that that person be named now, because there is so much to do with regards to that, for that individual and for that office. I'd like to yield now to the ranking member, Ms. Bass, for any opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as I listen to your comments, one more time, I will tell you that I think you need to do a book talking about your 3-decade experience in fighting for human rights. And I think your opening statement was another example of that. I want to welcome the witness and the members of the audience. Thank you for being here. We're here this morning to hear from our expert witness about what is growing anti-Semitism across borders. What is most important to me is not to hear only the perspective of the witnesses on the reasons for increased incidents of anti-Semitism in the world, but to learn where this trend is most prevalent overseas and who is behind the rise in anti-Semitism. Equally important is to learn how these trends must be dealt with, assertively or otherwise. I believe that these trends must be dealt with assertively and that the United States must take a leadership role in such efforts. We can't look the other way, either overseas or domestically, regarding anti-Semitism. We must stand up against all forms of bias. We can't pick and choose when it's convenient to stand against bias and when it's not. We must call it out whenever we see it. The role of the Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism came into being by way of the Global Anti-Semitism Review Act of 2004 that the chairman spoke about because he authored it. I also believe that it is critical to have a special envoy at the State Department responsible for addressing anti-Semitism globally. I oppose reported attempts by the administration to cut funding for the special envoy. I think it's a position with the goal of monitoring and combating anti-Semitism worldwide, and the reestablishment of this position is a priority. I also want to say that while today's hearing is to address what is going on around the world, we do need to acknowledge what is going on in our own country. We need to acknowledge the fact that there have been threats at Jewish community centers around the country. There's been desecration of Jewish cemeteries. The community that I represent in Los Angeles, a large part of it is the Jewish community, and there have been numerous threats to the Jewish community centers in my district. And in fact, I'm meeting with a group of constituents from one of those centers in the next couple of weeks when we're on our break. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. I appreciate your very kind comments, and I reciprocate and thank you for your leadership for all these years, too, both in the state legislature and now here in Washington. And you're right, you know, the immediate genesis for this hearing was what's happening in the United States. We are a Foreign Affairs Committee, but the linkages, obviously, between the two are inescapable. So thank you for underscoring that so well. Mr. Swazi.
I want to thank you also, Mr. Chairman. This is the first time I heard you speak at length at this as a freshman, and I'm very impressed by all the things that you've done throughout your career and the things that you had to say today. And I'm looking forward to working in a bipartisan fashion to combat this evil in the world. This is very important in my district, and people in my district are very concerned about this issue. We've had many threats at our Jewish community centers, and we read the reports of what's going on throughout the world. So I want to thank you for your leadership, and I want to thank the ranking member for her leadership as well.
Thank you, Ms. Swazi. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, and I will echo and associate myself with the words complimenting the chairman for all of his work and commitment to this issue. In my district, this is an issue that is affecting many of the institutions. Anti-Semitism is affecting institutions in Chicago, throughout the country, something of grave concern. As a Jewish member of Congress, this is an issue that is also very personal. And while I don't have prepared remarks, I'd like to share a very brief story. I got a letter from my cousin when I first came to Congress 4 years ago, reminding me that his grandfather, my great-uncle, my grandmother's brother, used to keep a chocolate bar in his drawer. And he did it as a reminder of what this country offered. My grandmother's family came from Kiev. They fled the pogroms in 1912. And that chocolate bar was a reminder of the opportunity of this great country. but also a reminder to him of where they came from and that they needed to be prepared to move at any moment, because as Jews, they were always under threat. And at that time, when I received the letter from my cousin Jordan, I thought, yes, but we're in a different place now. 4 years later, we're seeing a rise of anti-Semitism around the globe and in this country. Jordan wrote me a letter recently talking about his family on the other side, because the family we share has grown. They came here in 1912. There's over 100 in the next generation, in my generation and our children's generation. But on Jordan's other side, that family was in Gorno. They were not able to come into this country. They were denied access, and they were completely wiped out in the Holocaust. They understand, my family understands the impact of anti-Semitism and what it can do, and we need to be prepared to address it. In January of 2015, I went to France with Jewish Federations of North America to talk to the community there shortly after the Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher attacks. France, as you will touch on in your testimony, has taken direct steps to address anti-Semitism in its country, and we've seen good progress. We need to continue to do that in this country. We need to work with our allies around the world and stand up wherever we can. So this is a very important hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking the lead in calling this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony, but more importantly, thank you for the work you and your institutions do in standing up to anti-Semitism here and around the world. We need to make sure that never again is not just a motto, but is a reality, and that we address anti-Semitism, because it doesn't just affect Jews, it affects everybody. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Mr. Schneider, thank you very much for your very strong comments. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Mr. Paul Goldenberg, who is the National Director of the Secure Community Network. He is also Chairman and President of Cardinal Point Strategies and a member of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Council. He is the former Vice Chair of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Faith-Based Council and is Senior Advisor to the Department's newly established Countering Violent Extremism Initiative. Mr. Goldenberg is a Senior Advisor to the Faith-Based Community Security Program at Rutgers University, and in that capacity has worked closely on the ground with European Jewish communities, European Jewish security groups, and note parenthetically, years back was the chief promoter, an architect of an initiative to train the trainers, which had a very, very laudable impact on law enforcement and recognizing anti-Semitism for what it was and not being just disregarded as hooliganism or some other crime, looking at that motive, and he was very, very instrumental in that. I'd like to then introduce our second speaker. Witness Rabbi Andy Baker, who is Director of International Jewish Affairs for the American Jewish Community and the personal representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Chair in Office on Combating Anti-Semitism. He is responsible for maintaining and developing AJC's network of relationships with Jewish communities throughout the diaspora and addressing the accompanying international issues and concerns. He has been a prominent leader in addressing Holocaust-era issues in Europe and in international efforts to combat anti-Semitism. Rabbi Baker has served as the president of the Washington Board of Rabbis, president of the Interfaith Conference of Washington, and commissioner on the District of Columbia's Human Rights Commission. We'll then hear from Mark Weitzman, who is Director of Government Affairs and the Director of the Task Force Against Hate and Terrorism for the Wiesenthal Center. He is also Chief Representative of the Center to the United Nations in New York. Mr. Weitzman is a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, where he chairs the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial. He also co-chairs the Working Group on International Affairs of the Global Forum on Anti-Semitism. Mr. Weitzman has authored many publications and books and is the winner of the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for Best Anthology for Anti-Semitism. We'll then hear from Ms. Stacy Burdett, who is the Anti-Defamation League's Vice President for Government Relations, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. She heads the Government and National Affairs Office, which represents ADL to the federal government, foreign embassies, and policy community on a full range of ADL issues. As lead lobbyist on international issues, Ms. Burdett is the face of ADL to Congress, the administration, and foreign diplomats. And as I said a moment ago, I've known Stacy for so many years and so deeply appreciate her great leadership in this great and important fight. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Goldenberg for his opening.
Thank you, and it's an honor and privilege for me to be here today. I apologize for being a bit tardy. I think I rang off too many bells at the security checkpoint outside, which is not the first time. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for allowing me to testify today regarding the current state of affairs in Europe, specifically the increased levels of hate-motivated incidences impacting Jewish communities. There has also been a wave, as we all know in this room, of similar events here in the United States, where perpetrators on both sides of the Atlantic, unfortunately, may be feeding into each other. I'm both proud and honored to be here with such a distinguished group of colleagues today, and I applaud you and your committee for the steadfast commitment and unwavering support. In 2004, as you know, Congressman Smith appointed me to work overseas through the good efforts of the OSCE, so I speak to you today through a different set of optics. I am a former law enforcement veteran, and as they say in the business, I see things quite differently. We worked across 10 European nations, working hand in hand with Andy Baker, Mark, and our colleagues at the Anti-Defamation League for nearly 7 years. Over the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of working closely with the faith-based security program at Rutgers University, where we are now working abroad in places like Molenbeek, Brussels, Copenhagen. And as part of this new initiative under the leadership of former Attorney General John Farmer, we've made countless trips in recent months abroad, traveling to multiple European cities. So we speak with some passion on this subject. Through these trips, I've been able to gain a firsthand understanding of the current climate, hearing the concerns of Jewish communities under threat, and assessing what we can all do collaboratively to assist them. Just 2 weeks ago, I sat with the chief rabbi of Belgium in the Great Synagogue in Brussels, an institution that survived several wars, still stood strong after the Holocaust, a beautiful, celebrated structure that once again is surrounded by armed paratroop soldiers with long assault rifles. However, they serve not as an occupying or threatening force, but as protectors of a community. And similar scenes, we all know, are in Belgium, France, Denmark, and other Western nations. Armed military troops, once again, surrounding Jewish institutions just decades after the Holocaust. Consider the United Kingdom. There was a record number of anti-Semitic offenses in 2016. The Community Security Trust recorded 1,309 anti-Semitic incidents nationwide during that year, a 36% increase from the 960 recorded by the CST in 2015. Previously, record high occurrences have been triggered by anti-Semitic reactions to sudden, specific geopolitical events, leading to temporary spikes in occurrences. In contrast, and I can say almost the same for here in the United States, there was no single sudden event in 2016. In 2014, for instance, there were 1,182 incidents recorded up until that year. This previous highest total coincided with a conflict between Israel and Hamas, which saw a global, again, rise in anti-Semitism and incidents of a similar nature. In contrast, as I stated, there was no single sudden trigger event in 2016. And these high number of incidents, both here and abroad, I have used the term, are unprecedented. In Germany, according to the Coordination Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism, the CFCA, increased to a parallel, as they note, the general rise of far-right crime since the beginning of the migrant crisis. The number of criminal investigations opened following attacks on Jews, Jewish property, and hate speech against Jews amounted to 2,083 cases during 2015, an increase of 201% from the previous year. And as I heard Mr. Schneider, Congressman Schneider, a glimmer of hope still exists in France. Following years of significant incidents and attacks, the same CFCA report notes a significant decline of anti-Semitic incidents in 2016 after 2015 was characterized by a rise of anti-Semitic incidents. Experts that I've spoken to and many of us have collaborated with attribute the decline to a strong and swift response by the government in launching a campaign against anti-Semitism against the country. First and foremost, that means engaging with the nation's law enforcement forces and agencies. As a result, Jewish communities abroad are not only rethinking their approach to security, they are already changing their daily routines, adopting new ways of doing things, and deciding when and where to go, from synagogue to grocery store, based not on their desires, but on their fears and insecurity. I had the privilege to testify last April before the U.S. Helsinki Commission on anticipating and preventing deadly attacks on European Jewish communities. The concerns expressed then and the premonitions made regarding the migration of hatred, particularly anti-Semitism, has unfortunately manifested itself in the form of bomb threats, hate crimes, and cemetery desecrations, as we have seen as of late right here in the United States. Ever more connected, these extremist groups in the United States are borrowing, adapting, and enhancing the tactics and strategies adapted and adopted in Europe. Just a few more statistics, unfortunately. According to a recently distributed report by the New York City Police Department, they found that hate crimes against Jewish people more than doubled in the city since the start of the new year as compared to the same time period in 2016. The report documents 56 hate crimes from January 1st to February 12th, with 28 incidents targeting Jews. In the same 6-week period, the previous year, the total number of hate crimes recorded in New York City was only 31, with 13 targeting Jews. A recent ADL report on anti-Semitic acts that targeted journalists between August 2015 and July 2016 uncovered an astonishing 2.6 million tweets containing language frequently used in anti-Semitic speech. Again, an unprecedented number. As part of our own independent research, with regard to statistics, just over the last 75 days in the United States of America, from January 1st to March 13th, 307, and that number is fluid, it's changing, 307 anti-Jewish incidents across 40 states in 75 days. Since the beginning of the year, we've exceeded 170 bomb threats, phoned in or emailed to 117 Jewish institutions, centers, schools, ADL offices, and other establishments, leading to massive disruptions and evacuations of thousands of people, to include children and infants. Indeed, one of the most enduring images of 2017 for the Jewish community may be the scenes of children being rushed into the freezing winter temperatures to evacuate JCCs right in our own backyards, and those of empty cribs abandoned in parking lots as dedicated staff members, infants, and toddlers rolled these mechanisms out of their facilities to safe locations. This phenomenon can be summed up briefly by sharing one incident in Whitefish that we need to note for the record. Whitefish, Montana, a small, pristine, beautiful town with warm and welcoming people. The location hosts, in addition to a small community, one of the most well-known members of the white supremacist movement in the country. As Jews throughout the United States were readying their homes for Hanukkah celebration, the Jewish community of Whitefish was courageously dealing with intimidation, threats of violence, and harassment from outside agitators. Marches, armed marches, were threatened against Jews. Fake news stories alleging conspiracies by the Jewish community of Whitefish against their longtime neighbors were alleged, and here is the most egregious. The pictures of children of the rabbi and Jewish leaders were posted on neo-Nazi websites calling for the followers to troll and harass the children. Attacks that specifically target children are abhorrent and unthinkable and would have the capability to paralyze any American town anywhere in the United States. In closing, beyond death and destruction, we know that these hate groups and terrorists, whether neo-Nazi, white supremacists, or Islamist extremists, they seek to create a sense of fear and vulnerability. If they are successful, this can be more impactful than any attack on us, the Jewish people, the American people, forcing us to not only query the safety and security of the societies we live in, but causing us to question our own ability to protect our neighborhoods and families. And with this, potentially causing us to change our behavior, retracting from our daily lives, our way of living, compromising our beliefs, whether that means altering how we dress, or even more disconcerting, after the recent bomb threats, hearing that some who have come to relish and rely on the remarkable services offered by these Jewish community centers may be reassessing their members grounded on fear. The American Jewish community very much remains open for business. We are back in our houses. We are back in our centers. We've been back in our schools. We are back in our institutions. We are training. We are working with our police agencies. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the FBI have done a remarkable job working with the community each and every day. So we are very much open for business, remain open, and you know, I look forward to any questions that you may have, sir.
Mr. Goldenberg, thank you very much for that very, very powerful testimony and those insights. Before going to our next witness, at the request of my distinguished ranking member, we'll go to Stacey Burdette. She has invited her, and unfortunately, the gentlelady has a schedule conflict that she has to be at. Ileana Russ-Layton, same thing. She probably will come back, but I would just note for the record that the chairman emeritus is the chairman of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee. She's the co-chair of the Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, and recently appointed to the Council on U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum by Speaker Ryan, and she will be back shortly, but she wanted to convey to you that how much she appreciates your being here and your testimony. I'd also like to just recognize Ira Foreman, who was the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism from 2013 to 2016. Thank you so very much, Mr. Special Envoy, for being here, for your work, which was greatly appreciated by all of us. And know that you'll be invited. We want you to come and give your insights perhaps at the next hearing when we have the administration here as well with the new special envoy. I'd like to now ask Ms. Burdette if you would proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Ranking Member, for inviting me here. And thank you for your leadership in convening this hearing. And thank you, Mr. Swazi. We are all freshmen here. We are all learning new lessons. We are all taking on new commitments, and you don't have to chair a committee to make an impact on this issue. So you're honoring me with your time today. I'd like to request that my full statement and attachments be made part of the record.
Objection to order.
Thank you. And I'd like to just take some time to highlight a couple of key lessons that I think can complement what my friends and colleagues are saying. We've learned a lot from the moment that we're in, and we have to take those lessons very quickly and turn them into lessons that animate our actions. Anti-Semitism is a global problem. You've heard from my colleague and friend Paul Goldenberg. No country is immune, not even a remarkable country like ours. And the fight for policies and institutions is one that we have to fight every day. The chairman knows from his work in the OSCE, vital democratic protections and freedoms, they're not self-executing. And we're in that fight right now. And our success is extremely consequential, not just for Jewish communities, but for America, for its moral leadership, for societies around the world, and Madam Ranking Member, for every community in the United States that feels a little more unwelcome or unsafe today. The fight against anti-Semitism is inextricably connected. When we have fought anti-Semitism in America and around the world, everyone and their children sleep a little bit easier at night. So thank you for that important message. I have appended to my testimony a map of this country that illustrates what probably is imprinted on Paul's mind every night when he goes to sleep, a map of where these threats are. We know that conspiracy theories are taking center stage in everyone's political debate, ours, all countries all over the world. And they can broadcast that hate. David Duke and the alt-right can go right into the palm of your hand and scare you, right where you live, or engage in trolling and doxing, like what Paul described in Whitefish, Montana, where you post people's information publicly And you don't even have to say anything. You don't have to threaten anything. You can just say, tell them how you feel. Tell these Jewish people how you feel. Don't do anything illegal. That's extremely personal, close to the bone. And we've learned that these threats start online, but boy, they move offline into the real world where they're very dangerous. ADL is increasing our investment in this area. We have just last week announced the opening of a new Center on Technology and Society that will be based in Silicon Valley. We've already been engaging with industry leaders in Europe, in the United States, all over the world, and using multilateral forums, international organizations that are the purview of this subcommittee, like UNESCO, like the UN's Alliance of Civilization, like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Those are forums where lawmakers and policymakers like you are networking with each other to adopt best practices, codes of conduct. We are networking in international fora with NGOs, and both sides of this table, we have our international fora where we can band together to fight this cyber harassment. And my colleague also referenced a big data study that ADL released during the election campaign. And those billions, 10 billion impressions of anti-Semitic tweets, I think we all were paying attention. They targeted about a dozen journalists, Jewish journalists, in ways that we know made those reporters stand up and say, I'm going to give it a moment of thought before I cover a candidate or an individual in an honest way. It might not be worth it to me to be so harassed. So that gives us pause. So the government has a primary responsibility to make people feel safe, to model good behavior, and to spotlight the problem. I've included 10 recommendations. I hope they're all easy. I want to just highlight a couple because I think you're going to get a lot of good recommendations today. America's human rights and democracy programs that former Special Envoy Ira Foreman has expanded, enhanced, mobilized, energized, put them, as the chairman said, on steroids. Those programs, they're part of our foreign affairs machinery, and they can't be effective on the cheap. Every single one of you is going to cast a vote about our foreign affairs budget, and I would like you to keep in mind that our ability to fight anti-Semitism around the world depends on having the resources to engage the world successfully. I just want to highlight one other area, and this is in my recommendations as well. One of the most remarkable things we do as a country when we report human rights violations in every country in the world, when we spotlight those problems, we are not only setting a moral marker, setting a tone that we hope other countries will follow, we do something vital. We lead by example. We have always done that. Our moral leadership deeply matters in this world and in this fight. And when a monster goes to a Jewish cemetery in St. Louis to turn over 100 and some heavy tombstones, that's a powerful attack on the presence of that community. Whether it's in Missouri or in Pennsylvania or in Central Europe, you are saying your perpetuity, your children, your presence is offensive to people. Be afraid. And we want to make sure that not only are governments around the world reporting these incidents, please take a look at my second appendix. It's a scorecard of 57 countries where, with the help of Rabbi Baker and Chairman Smith, we now have data in 57 OSCE countries. But I want you to remember, please, one number, 3,441. 3,441. That is the number of American police departments that don't report any hate crime. When a monster comes to that cemetery, nobody tells the FBI. We don't know what's happening there. Paul is correct. Law enforcement does a remarkable job. We are a model for the world, but we have to fight for our standing as a country that leads by example. And so in California, all over the world, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, in Paterson, New Jersey, in Newark, there's just too many people there, too much diversity to believe that there were 0 hate crimes in 2015. So for freshmen, for Mr. Swazi, you can leave this chamber, and law enforcement in your state and in your district, they care very much what you think about the importance of making sure that we lead by example and that we bother to tell the FBI when people in our communities are targeted by hate. I can't thank you all enough for your attention and for your leadership. And I would like to make an additional request. Perhaps it might be helpful if I would enter into the record a list of cities in the United States of over 100,000 residents who either report 0 hate crimes or don't bother to give an answer at all. That's a good follow-up item for every member of this body. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Burdett. Thank you, Ms. Bass. I'd like to now yield to Rabbi Baker, and without objection, your last request will be made part of the record.
Chairman Smith, thank you for this opportunity to testify, but thank you and your colleagues for the leadership you've shown really over a very long period of time. I think we all know, and you cited earlier, the U.S. effort in the case of the OSCE, but in other areas, to get countries to focus on this problem, to really step up and address it, was critical. And starting with that first OSCE conference and all the various other things that have followed. It should also be noted that before the U.S. government really got engaged, it was you and other members of Congress that pushed an administration, often not because of opposition to the subject, but perhaps complications, difficulty within the OSCE, the consensus process, and other things. So without the advocacy here, I think much of what we've been able to do would not have succeeded, and it's a lesson that we need to keep in front of us even as we go forward. I would like, for the record, that you accept my written testimony, and here I will simply try to highlight what I've tried to present more as a kind of progress report, and again, with a particular focus on the problem in Europe. Security, as you've already heard, has been a paramount issue. And the fact is, for many years, we had a real difficulty in getting governments to recognize the challenges, the very need for security that Jewish communities were witnessing. It had much to do, I think, with the advocacy of many of the organizations represented here and so on, to get governments to pay attention. But at the same time, and tragically, it was only after some of these terrorist attacks, deaths in Brussels, in Paris, in Copenhagen, that governments at least began to recognize, yes, we recognize the problem. But doing something was another issue altogether. And we've seen success, but we know it's only partial. Congressman Schneider referenced France earlier. It is true that because of what we saw there, the government stepped forward. It literally mobilized the military. And so every school, every synagogue, every community building was protected. And incidents went down last year, and in significant numbers. Even, it appears, Jews leaving France, a real problem itself, that number has decreased. But the Jewish community knows, and we've now seen, this was not a permanent step. That security is no longer there. The government can't afford to do this, and in fact, terrorist threats are present throughout the country. So what will happen, how to keep that attention, how to keep that mobilization is still not certain. In Sweden, which has the largest Jewish community in Scandinavia, we've seen them begin to mobilize, recognize the security needs are real. We've pushed governments to come forward with funding. In effect, the mere practice of your religious freedom is challenged if people are fearful of going out in public, being physically identified as Jews, in some cases simply attending a Jewish event has caused people to second guess and think about what they're doing. So in Stockholm and Malmo, there are now efforts. Paul and I recall particularly visiting Malmo and at the time seeing the embattled nature of that Jewish community. There is security support. We didn't have that before. There are more funds going to support community institutions. But more is still needed. And the communities in both places will still tell us, yes, we have some help, but the governments which have begun to mobilize need to do more. In a place like the UK, we have probably the best example of good cooperation between a Jewish community and government authorities. The UK's Jewish Community Security Trust has been monitoring incidents, has in fact been directly training police, and there is not only in this relationship something that has provided a real security net for the Jewish community, they're now being asked to help assist in providing security for other religious communities in the UK. It is a model, it's one we've cited before and deserves recognizing still again. It has also worked, as we know, the problem not only with cyber hate, but of conveying information through the internet and through social media, and finding some very good ways of using that to alert a Jewish community when there are problems or when there are steps that are being taken. And finally, the OSCE's ODIHR has been implementing, developing a multi-year program known as Words into Action, specifically to focus on problems of anti-Semitism, security being one of them. With significant funds coming from the German government, the first measure they will take is producing a guideline, a security toolkit, if you will, on what governments, what NGOs, what different authorities should be doing when it comes to Jewish community security. And this should be presented later this spring, first in Europe, but we certainly hope they will come here and we'll have an opportunity to share what their recommendations are here in the United States. Turning to a second issue, we've made efforts to convey the importance of having a clear and comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism. This goes back, as you know, over a decade. It may have been when first studies were done in the European Union in 2003 and 2004, even the monitors conducting those surveys didn't have a full appreciation of anti-Semitism and what it was. Yes, maybe they understood hatred, prejudice, discrimination toward Jews, but anti-Semitism presenting itself through conspiracy theories about Jews, anti-Semitism through the vehicle of Holocaust denial, and, as you cited and referencing Natan Sharansky, understanding how Israel can itself be a target or a form of anti-Semitism. Again, when it's declared a racist endeavor, when its very existence is challenged, when analogies are drawn to the Nazi treatment of Jews, it's not criticism, it's anti-Semitism. And we've had success in getting governments and getting organizations to recognize the value of a comprehensive definition, starting with that EUMC working definition a decade ago, looking to individual countries to employ it. Our own government and the Office of the Special Envoy has used a version of that definition with great success last year, and considerable kudos to my colleague Mark Weitzman. The IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, essentially took that definition and managed to secure its adoption for use by IRA and its 31 member countries. With that in mind, the OSCE chair last year, German Foreign Minister, now President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, said he wanted to secure the adoption by the OSCE for use in the OSCE of this definition. It was a considerable hurdle to get 57 countries to agree by consensus. Coming down to the wire in Hamburg, as you know, we ultimately got 56 of those 57 countries to agree. Only one, the Russian Federation, stood in the way. For reasons I can go into later if you're interested, but they were more excuses, they weren't legitimate reasons. We very much hope it will be possible, changing dynamics perhaps, that during this calendar year we could get the Russians to come on board and, with the assistance of the now Austrian OSCE chair in office, try to push for that adoption in December 2017. In the meantime, the UK government has formally adopted this definition. We've managed to get justice ministers in Germany and Austria to say they will use it in training police and prosecutors. We have even a formal statement by all of the EU countries within the OSCE endorsing this. So we hope more steps can be taken to put it into use. I'll turn to a third area. It is one that has been with us, but in fact it's flaring up yet again, and that's the question of balancing the principles of religious freedom with maybe more secular forces in society. And I speak now about the elemental practices for Jews and for Muslims. They go back really to biblical times of ritual circumcision, of ritual slaughter. They really are elemental to practicing religion today. But they've been under attack. Animal rights activists, children's rights advocates, maybe with genuine, legitimate motives, but they would seek to ban this practice of slaughter or limit the ability to circumcise our youth, our infants. And in this process, Jews now have to defend something they've been doing literally for centuries. It may not be in its initial intent an anti-Semitic campaign, but it surely is often in its result. By the way, it also links Jews and Muslims together. And so where there have been some success, it has really depended on an alliance as both communities confront this problem together. Finally, and with this I will close, we have to recognize there is still great unease at a very uncertain political climate when we look across the European continent. We see the success of right-wing, nationalist, xenophobic parties and movements, in some cases winning at the ballot box, finding their way into parliaments, even threatening, as we've seen in a couple of countries, to ascend to serious positions, such as the office of president. In many cases, these are parties and movements that are virulently anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Roma, but anti-Semitic has also been a significant theme of them, and Jews do not feel comfortable, even if it appears that the first target is someone else. In fact, as we've learned here in America, as has already been stated, I think our ability to combat anti-Semitism, to feel safe and secure, is part of the larger fight to combat racism, discrimination, xenophobia across the board. Having said that, Europe has some special challenges today. There are significant numbers of Arabs and Muslims, many more coming in as part of refugees and migrants from North Africa, from the Middle East, and many of them have attitudes, come with, frankly, sentiments and views that are anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, also in many cases anti-Western. The societies that have received these people, also that have had some difficulty in assimilating and integrating those who come before them, need to recognize this and try and step up and do more. The fact is, Jewish communities have often confronted this significant increase in incidents of harassment or attack coming largely from parts of these communities. Not all governments are willing to confront this with a clear-eyed approach. And if they don't, they're not going to really be successful in figuring out strategies to deal with it. Short-term when it comes to security, but long-term when it comes to educational efforts and the like. So here, too, we need to keep focused on what's in front of us. I think to recognize we've had success, we have attention, we need to keep the support and the moral focus here in America to really assist us in this continuing combat, this continuing battle that we're waging across the ocean in Europe. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rabbi Baker, for that very extensive set of recommendations and the overview that you've provided us. And without objection to your full statement, and this goes for all of our distinguished witnesses, and any attachments you would like to make a part of the record, so ordered. Mr. Weitzman.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks and appreciation to you for your leadership in Congress and internationally, and as well as for your personal activism on this issue, which we know is extended beyond just the legislative field, but really to going out and intervening in cases directly. And your leadership is much appreciated. I also want to thank the ranking member and the members of the subcommittee, and as a fellow New Yorker, to appreciate my appreciation to Mr. Swosey for his remarks and his presence on this issue as well. Anti-Semitism today is no longer limited to verbal expressions of hate. It's fueled by the stream of propaganda that radical Islamists put out online and the financial and political contributions to this campaign that come from some Muslim states and organizations. An increasing number of terrorists have translated words into actions and assaulted and murdered Jews throughout Europe and targeted Jewish institutions in Europe and the U.S. They have been joined in recent years and recent months by members of the radical right, extremists coming from all aspects of society and fringes of society, who have targeted Jews as their primary target. Continuing almost 20 years of efforts, the Simon Wiesenthal Center will be releasing next week its Digital Terrorism and Hate electronic report of extremism and anti-Semitism on the internet, which includes grading the social media companies. We see that there is a frequent correlation between the amounts of propaganda and extremism and hate that come out online and the surge in radicalization and terrorism that often follows. However, I would like to focus my remarks here on something that is somewhat different, and it is an aspect of political anti-Semitism, especially Holocaust distortion, that we can now see in growing circles of Western democracy and Western democratic countries. To focus on one country in particular, as an example, prime example of this, I'd like to turn my attention to what's happening in Poland currently, where we have high-ranking officials, such as the Minister of Defense, who has in the past accepted the possibility that the classic text of anti-Semitism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, are perhaps in fact true, and he claimed that experience quoting shows that there are such groups in Jewish circles. Two other ministers have declined to condemn the protocols. A prominent extremist Catholic radio station that has been condemned by the Vatican for anti-Semitism and by the State Department as one of Europe's most blatantly anti-Semitic media venues continues to find favor in government circles, having received grants totaling millions of dollars over the past year, and even had a postage stamp recently issued in its honor. Some of the quotes from people, the head of the radio station and commentators on the station include, quote, "The U.S. media and entertainment industry are dependent on the Jewish lobby. It is similar to the Stalinist terror, which was organized and implemented by Jewish communism." That speaker recently toured and spoke in New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts in an effort to raise money and continue spreading the message of hate, not just locally, but internationally. The director of the Polish Institute in Berlin was recently fired for allegedly giving too much attention to Jewish subjects. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, an amendment to a law that is being proposed in the Polish Sejm, the Polish Parliament, claims that whoever publicly claims, contrary to historical facts, the Polish nation or Polish state's responsibility or partial responsibility for Nazi crimes can be criminalized with potential 3-year sentence. That means, in effect, that anybody who refers in conversation, in writing, in research to murder of Jews during the Holocaust period by Poles has potentially committed a criminal act and can be sentenced up to 3 years in prison. I went to the files, the archives of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and just picked out 3 witness testimonies, survivor testimonies of survivors, and these are in my written remarks, and these survivors all testified to their experience where they found that the local population had been more deadly than the Nazis. And for all sorts of reasons, this is found in many cases throughout occupied Europe. through the Baltics, through other countries in Eastern and Central Europe, and it is not an uncommon experience. But those survivors, in the twilight of their years now, can be found liable and sentenced for just recalling what happened to them and giving their impressions of that, and this is now potentially entering into law into Poland. It will also have a greatly chilling effect on future research as well as freedom of speech in that country, where young scholars may be inhibited from even studying the Holocaust, people may be inhibited from publishing their research and their findings, and it is an attempt to essentially legislate history for political purposes. The prime focus of that has been the Princeton professor Jan Gross, who remarks in an interview he gave in a German newspaper last year, have been potentially seen as falling in violation of one of these types of laws. Charges were investigated and considered being brought. The first prosecutor in the case declined to bring charges. The superior reopened the investigation in what appeared to be a politically motivated effort there. Poland is not the only case. It is perhaps the most acute, but it is by far the only case. The Ukraine has passed a similar law about anyone shaming the reputation of the fighters for Ukrainian independence, who include the partisan units that were responsible for murdering over 100,000 Poles and tens of thousands of Jews. In Russia, a law that forbids publication of what they describe as falsehoods about the Soviet Union's role during World War II has been used to convict a journalist who wrote, quote, "The communists and Germans jointly invaded Poland, sparking off World War II. That is, communism and Nazism closely collaborated." As we know, that is the historical fact of September 1939, when Poland was invaded on both sides by both those countries. Yet to state that in Putin's Russia now appears to be against the law. In Croatia, the Jewish community has felt compelled to boycott official Holocaust commemorations over the past 2 years. A former minister of culture in Croatia embraced the Ustashi, the Croatian collaborators, defended their actions in articles that he published, and was photographed in his younger days wearing an Ustashi hat, and screened a film in the Jasenovac concentration camp that minimized the number of victims, casting doubt on the authenticity of historical accounts of what happened in that camp. Recently, plaques have been put in front of the camp with Ustashi slogans, leading to the boycott for the second year. In Hungary, a proposed Holocaust museum was to be directed by a woman who has written articles with anti-Semitic themes in it, and the content was highly questionable. Statues were proposed to figures who had collaborated with the Nazis, including one such figure, an historian, who as a minister in the Croatian government and as a member of parliament and the Hungarian government introduced the Hungarian version of the Nuremberg laws, stripping Jews of their rights and protections of citizenship and opening the way to the eventual deportation and murder of almost 450,000 Jews. Writers who had collaborated with the Nazis and written anti-Semitic works were inserted into the school curriculum. A number of other issues went on to the point, again, where the Jewish community felt compelled to boycott the official commemorations of Hungarian Holocaust remembrance. Fortunately, there has been some successful pushback on this. The IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, has intervened both in Hungary and in the Polish issue. I was part of a 4-member delegation that went to Poland to discuss this with the Polish government in December. We're still waiting to hear positive results in Poland, but in Hungary, through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, through the direct intervention of Chairman Smith, who wrote a pivotal letter to Prime Minister Orban about the statues, through the efforts of Special Envoy Foreman and the State Department, the Hungarian government and the Prime Minister of Hungary announced that they would not erect any more statues. They would hold off on the statues. They have held off from continuing work on the museum, saying that they would only put the final exhibits in. The museum is built and currently exists as a shell, but they would only put the exhibits in with the approval of the local Jewish community as well as international experts. And in many ways, that shows the power of the international body and the United States that work on these issues to intervene positively on it. But this is some of the background to the American Jewish community's consternation to the White House statement regarding January 27th on the Holocaust that omitted mention of Jews. Even a mistake seen in the context of this background can be used by people with bad intentions. And as one crude example, last week a Seattle synagogue was vandalized with a slogan, "The Holocaust is fake history," put on it. So I'd like to conclude by reiterating a number of the sentiments that we've heard before and the recommendations, particularly in regard to the special envoy. And I would even like to suggest my institution has offered the suggestion that that position be upgraded to an ambassador level to raise it in status and show once again America's political and moral leadership on this issue, which is needed more now than ever before. I commend the bipartisan efforts on this. As you heard, we are firmly committed to seeing the fight against anti-Semitism as a bipartisan fight, and I'm happy that members of Congress in both houses have joined in that very strongly. I would also like to mention the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is now sitting in Congress, which is an act that attempts to ask the Department of Education to use the working definition of anti-Semitism as a tool to be able to gauge whether anti-Semitism acts of anti-Semitism have in fact happened on college campuses, and it gives this internationally accepted tool to the hands, it puts it in the hands of those people dealing with the issue on U.S. college campuses. Two other just quick mentions. We have also appealed to the Attorney General for the creation of a task force to deal with the issue of the wave of anti-Semitic threats that the American Jewish community is currently facing. And that ties into the other recommendation that I would add, which is the creation of a special portfolio or the addition of a portfolio that draws together on the domestic front the issue of anti-Semitism as the special envoy does the State Department for Foreign Affairs. There is no similar focal point in the United States for the issue of anti-Semitism, and we believe that it is time to create that point and thus provide a coordinating address to address the issue of anti-Semitism. And finally, I'd like to suggest that the internet service providers as well also adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism and the working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion as a tool to use in measuring their presence of anti-Semitism and their actions that they can take against it online. Finally, just to conclude and repeat what I said before, when governments try to legislate history for political purposes, when the Holocaust is taken out of context, is whitewashed, when Holocaust distortion opens the doors for traditional anti-Semitic themes to re-enter the governing halls of society, then that is a problem and a challenge and a threat, not only to Jews, but to Americans and democratic values all over. So I thank the committee for the opportunity to make this statement and for the leadership and activism that you have shown in the past, and I hope to continue cooperating and working together in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Weissman, thank you for your extraordinarily effective leadership and your recommendations and again, your analysis of the state of affairs as of today and looking forward. Let me just ask you if that report that will be released in about a week, if that's something we might be able to include in our record, because we'll leave the record open if you...
It usually comes out in electronic form. I could see if we have a version that we could include. We will try to do that.
If you could, that would be very helpful.
Absolutely.
I think for the record and for all of us to
Thank you.
read and digest. The ambassador at large, that is something we're looking at legislative text right now. So we'll get back to you on how we're proceeding on that. Last November, 2015, not last November, I authored HRES 354. And it passed 418 to 0 on the House floor. Many of you helped us with the text, with the analysis of what ought to be in there, and I deeply appreciate the insights you provided. And we did call the operative part of the resolution, urging the United States government to work closely with European governments and their law enforcement agencies to formally recognize, partner, train, and share information with Jewish community security groups, to strengthen preparedness, prevention, mitigation, and response related to anti-Semitic attacks, and to support related research initiatives. There are many operative clauses, but that was the first. And I'm wondering if, in your view, that happened, Do you believe it's going to happen, hopefully in an expanded way, or at least consistent with this request of the administration, because it's an ongoing request? And Rabbi Baker, if you might, others, if you'd like to as well, maybe share with us what you think are best practices that, we need to share every best practice we have, but what could we learn from the UK, from France, and others, particularly the United Kingdom, which I agree with you, have done much. They have so many challenges, particularly in London. You and I were there at the House of Commons when we both spoke to a large group of lawmakers from around the world, and it was very clear that the United Kingdom was really trying to step up to the plate on these horrific crimes. Are there things we might learn from them? But again, this was passed in 2015, so there were, and Ira Foreman probably could provide us some information on this as well. How well was that implemented? Because it was bipartisan, 418 to 0. And your thoughts going forward with the new administration to make sure that there's no gaps. Paul, if you want to start, then we'll go right down there.
So I think I'll address the police aspect of it, which is where I'm very engaged and involved abroad right now. We're actually working. We are working on the ground in Belgium with the Belgian police. We're actually working on the ground in Molenbeek. You have an area called Sablant, which is a very heavily Jewish area, and of course you have Molenbeek, which is an area that the majority of the population is Muslim. And we are working on the ground there with the police, building, it's called BCOT, building communities of trust between these communities. This is through the Rutgers Project, in particular a colleague of yours, Chairman Smith, Congressman Smith, which is John Farmer, former Attorney General of New Jersey. So it's engaging the communities, the security groups, and the police has been a bit of a challenge, but I will tell you, I think there's been tremendous progress over the past 24 months. It's really about compelling the national police agencies or the local police agencies to share information with the Jewish communities, really demystifying the process. That's extremely integral to better communications between the two. The Jewish communities need information. They need information that will allow them to be safer, and the law enforcement agencies also need to work much more collaboratively with those Jewish security agencies, not only for the sharing of information, but joint training, joint exercises, et cetera, because it's really a quid pro quo. Information comes up and information comes down. So it's really creating a clear pathway of communication between the national and local police agencies and the Jewish communities that are sworn to protect them. We have a much more mature relationship here. The American Jewish community, through the works of SCAN, Secure Community Network, ADL, a committee, and other organizations, it's been a very mature relationship. These relationships have been for decades, I know, and there are some really remarkable best practices here that for years have been shared with our colleagues abroad. So it's, at the end of the day, these communities have to rely on their local police, and that's where it starts, and that's where, unfortunately, it
Could I just ask you, to Stacy Burdett's point about local police here and in Europe, is it getting down to that level so that the local law enforcement, I mean, we put that into our resolution as well, ensure law enforcement personnel are effectively trained to monitor, prevent, and respond to anti-Semitic violence, and to partner with Jewish communities. And that second part, partner with Jewish communities, is so extremely important, so that there's that dialogue, so if there is something that's happening or there's a threat, there's a response that is informed by law enforcement.
Is that here in the United States or abroad?
Here and abroad.
Well, I will tell you, here in the United States, absolutely. The relationships between state, local, and federal law enforcement is absolutely extraordinary. And I know, I'm not going to speak for the Anti-Defamation League, but our two organizations are in constant contact every day with our state, local, and federal law enforcement agencies. They not only have been sharing information as best they can with regard to active investigations, but I will tell you, in the aftermath of, well, not the aftermath, it's still ongoing, but during this situation where we see nearly 170 bomb threats against Jewish centers, that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security deployed nearly 120 professionals. Every state in the country has what's called a protective security advisor. These are very high-level, experienced individuals that were literally deployed to work and engage with the Jewish community centers, not just for partnership purposes, but to provide real, viable expertise to them. So that's how far it went. And we met with the FBI just recently, 2 weeks ago, with Director Comey, and undoubtedly every Jewish leader that walked out of there had an extremely high level of confidence in the Bureau and what they're doing, and how engaged they are.
If I just walk right down, Rabbi Baker.
So let me just sort of outline where I think we've succeeded and where your legislation clearly resonates, and where there are still challenges, at least in Europe. One of the significant challenges has been to essentially get those European Jewish communities themselves to engage, yes, to develop the kind of professionalism to know how to handle security issues. That's varied greatly community by community. As we mentioned, the UK and France are very good models. Other countries are coming to this late. But there are efforts really to get all of them up to a certain level. At that point, the concern is also the kind of relationships that can develop with local and national authorities, police, intelligence gathering agencies, and the like. That varies greatly from place to place. That's sort of one of the sad realities, but we've tried to sort of leverage good practices in one country to encourage, to push other countries to follow suit. As you may recall, when in my OSCE role, I made an official visit to Copenhagen, which happened to have been 5 months before that terrorist attack that left one security volunteer dead. Authorities in Denmark said to me, here we have a relaxed approach to security, relaxed approach. And by that they meant we were concerned, they told me, that our citizens would feel uncomfortable if they saw armed police in front of a building. And so for that reason, they weren't providing police in front of the synagogue or the school, with ultimately the tragic results that took place. There was a mindset that had to be addressed and ultimately changed. And in dealing with this issue of security, if the governments don't recognize the genuine threat, it's hard to feel you're going to succeed. Those terrible incidents maybe have helped galvanize that attention. But it still has challenges in finding its way into the different communities and municipalities. We mentioned the challenges in Malmö, Sweden. When I was there this past September, and I asked the person responsible in the municipality for security about there really not being any give and take, communication with the local Jewish community, he said to me, you know, and he's a veteran himself of police, I don't get responses from Stockholm, from the national government, when they know we have threats in this community. So part of the problem isn't just the communication between Jewish community professionals and government, it's even within governments themselves that leave groups, leave people vulnerable. So this has been part of these issues. Clearly, where you can, and some of these best practice models point to good cooperation, sharing of information, not only of threats, but of collecting data and the like, because often Jewish communities with professional monitoring agencies will find that community members who've experienced incidents will report to them, even if they're reluctant to report to police. They know they're going to be taken seriously, and a good relationship means that same information can then find its way to government authorities. So those are sort of some of the examples where, again, we've had progress, but still challenges remain.
I just want to suggest 3 ideas on this topic. You asked about local law enforcement. We're in a period of transition. We haven't heard an affirmation of the Department of Justice commitment to train law enforcement on data collection, reporting, hate crime investigations, prosecutorial skills that they need. That is something that is very high on our wish list as we look at these bomb threats and the rise of hate crimes in the country. So every day is a good day to reaffirm, if you want to see the best hate crime training manual that I have seen, the FBI has one, and we should use it. It's very good. It includes scenarios that all kinds of NGOs have worked on. And speaking of training manuals, I know, Mr. Chairman, it can be important when a member of Congress inquires into a government program. You know quite well the international law enforcement academies that our FBI runs on every continent. And the ILEA has a hate crime curriculum that they're using. It's a training that's been delivered. It's a proprietary document, and it might be something that you might want to request from the State Department, INL, to take a look at that curriculum and how it's being used and how that existing training on hate crime, how we can make sure that it's also helping law enforcement officers get the skills to address anti-Semitism. So that's just our own training that we're already doing. And we also have an existing interagency initiative that's been, for a while, coordinated out of the White House that brings together law enforcement agencies to make sure there's a coordinated and vigorous effort to investigate hate crimes and reach out to communities. So those are three very concrete things that I think would be useful if it were requested by members of Congress. Thank you.
I'd just like to add two very brief points. One is that we have my colleagues are continuing their training sessions on digital terrorism and hate with law enforcement at a basic local level. We just had a session in Chicago about 2 weeks ago. But I also point out one area of concern, which Rabbi Baker can certainly address as well very deeply, that we hear periodically through some of the European countries that they no longer want to bear the cost of paying for security, and they would like to pass that on to the local Jewish community. I find that very troubling, and I think that it is something that we need to be re-emphasize the point that security is something that needs to be provided to all citizens without their having to pay extra for the right to live and exist in those countries.
Just a few final questions, and I'll yield to my good friend from New York. Let me, one of my previous hearings that I've had, as I indicated, quite a few, about 18 or 19 on combating anti-Semitism. And every time we learn things that just jump off the page as didn't know that it was that bad here or there, or that this particular practice was emerging as a more common and prevalent practice. Well, one of them, in February of 2013, I chaired a hearing on anti-Semitism, a growing threat to all faiths, and we tried to bring in how Catholics and other faiths, Islam and others, need to speak out more robustly against anti-Semitism. But we did have one individual, Willie Silberstein, from the Swedish Committee Against Anti-Semitism testify. And I had a number of press people who came afterwards and said, Sweden? You know, it's that bad in Sweden? And he said, and you mentioned it, Rabbi Baker, in your comments orally about Sweden briefly, but he said, let me start by telling you this about Schneur Kesselman. He is a rabbi born in the United States. He is working in the Swedish city of Malmo, which is rather infamous for its anti-Semitism in recent years. What differs him from other Jews of Malmo is that people can see that he is Jewish. He wears traditional clothes. For some years now, he has been systematically harassed. People spit on him, throw cans after him, threaten him, and call him things like a bloody Jew. He points out in his testimony that there's a large group of Muslims there. He does make the point that a large portion of the Muslim immigrants in Sweden are not anti-Semitic, but also that there are some that are. And that seems to be the game changer in that particular nation. And I'm wondering, you know, if they can't get it right in Sweden, which is known for its nonviolence and very tolerant attitudes, it's not a good sign, in my opinion. So I wonder if you might speak to that, Rabbi, what you found most recently in Sweden. Has it gotten any better? I remember at the Berlin conference, the chief rabbi of Berlin and I had dinner together, and he said, you know, it's not what it looks like here. He said, if I travel with traditional garb and I get onto a tram or a bus, I take or feel, and it's not just something he senses, he will have comments made. And he said, this is in Berlin in 2004. And he said, you know, so many Jewish individuals go out of their way to de-emphasize their Jewish character and by not wearing traditional garb, as this particular man in Sweden is. So that was a takeaway for me over that dinner with the chief rabbi in Berlin. Let me also say, Rabbi, if you could maybe speak to this, but as you might know, as you all know, you know for certain because you helped us write it and gave insight, the International Religious Freedom Act, the Frank Wolf bill that I am the prime author of, it took years to get enacted. It was signed in late December. Has a number of strong mutually reinforcing provisions to it, and I think it will make a difference, and it requires far more robust training than our State Department officers, DCMs, and departing ambassadors are getting as of now. They have not gotten it. The dream of 1998, when the IRFA bill was passed, Frank Wolf's bill, was that, okay, they've left that out. It's about time that combating anti-Semitism and all of the other religious freedom issues were really included in that training, and it turned out to be far less than what any of us thought the implementation phase would include. We now have good, strong language that makes it much stronger. And again, IRA worked on that, as you pointed out in your number 6 recommendation. So we got to make sure and monitor that it's being done well. But we also put in a provision, Rabbi, and you referenced this in your oral remarks, about the persecution of lawyers, politicians, or other human rights advocates seeking to defend rights of members of religious groups or highlight religious freedom violations, prohibitions on ritual animal slaughter or male infant circumcision, to include that in the annual IRFA report. So that will be in this report. It is required by this legislation. It was signed into law at the end of December, middle of December. So we're going to make sure that that's in there because, you know, as Sharansky said in Berlin, you can't fight something if you don't chronicle it. So we got to get the chronicling going in this aspect as well. So you might want to speak to Sweden and into this provision.
Sure. Well, yeah, with regard to Sweden, and I did actually also see Willie Silberstein when I was there this past September, and as I noted before, I was in Malmö. Actually, for the first time, they did apprehend and prosecute a perpetrator of an attack on this rabbi in Malmö. I guess that's good news. And I think they've been able to find him an apartment closer to the synagogue, so at least he's not the sort of visible target that he had become. The fact is that the challenge goes much beyond just this single rabbi. Malmö has really been the entry point for refugees and migrants coming into Sweden. And as I mentioned earlier, many of them come with attitudes from their host countries, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Western in various ways. In 2013, they had 800 foreigners that the city had to deal with. In 2015, they had 13,000. So the challenges are really dramatic, and they're not necessarily up to it. I think we recognize that. One bit of, I want to say, positive news, and this also concerns Malmö, there are efforts to secure a rabbi that would come to the city with a specific focus of working on interreligious and in particular Jewish-Muslim activities. And in this case, the Swedish national government would fund this project. At the time I was there, they were trying to identify someone. I don't know whether it's yet been implemented, but I think that was a good effort to say, let's see what we can do, because we know, as I've said earlier, much of this difficulty goes with attitudes in the Muslim community, and this would be a program focused really explicitly on that. I'm very happy to know that in the International Religious Freedom Report that this issue will be identified. We've been pushing also within the OSCE and hope and expect that there will be a conference later this year, probably in July, that will focus on religious freedom and ritual practice, to try to bring together those forces that are, making efforts to push back on these restrictions, and again, to say this is an essential element of freedom of religion and religious practice. But I think, again, we've seen before, when we have a U.S. report on interreligious freedom, on human rights, on anti-Semitism, it gets attention. Our respective organizations do maybe something similar. We will put out our reports, but in reality, governments pay attention if the U.S. government is citing this. So thank you so much for being able to see that this happens.
Mr. Swazi.
Mr. Chairman, let me say again that I want to thank you for your leadership on these issues, and I want you to know this is a very important issue to me, combating anti-Semitism and human rights in general, and I will always try and serve as a partner to you in any efforts that you have in this regard. I want to thank the witnesses for their fantastic work that they've done with their careers and throughout their lives on these issues, and I want to welcome them here today. To make you feel welcome, I just want to say Bruchim Habayim, and welcome you here to Washington today, and thank you for the work that you're doing again. I'm a former mayor and a county executive and very comfortable with the issues that you're talking about regarding law enforcement, having overseen a very large police department as Nassau County executive and a smaller police department as Glen Cove mayor, and know how important local law enforcement, both here in America and abroad, and the training that they receive on these issues is so essential. So anything that the chairman wants to try and promote in that respect, I'll be happy to support him in those efforts. It's important that we say on the record that the Jews have been persecuted for centuries, as all of you know, but it's important that I say it as well. And that, this is a persecuted minority. There are over 2 billion Christians in the world. There are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. There are 900 million Hindus in the world. There are 376 million Buddhists in the world. There are 23 million Sikhs in the world. And there are only 14 to 15 million Jews. And when you think about the number of 6 million people annihilated during the Holocaust, what an incredible statistic that is. And the persecution that the Jews have suffered for centuries is something we have to start worrying about again today. And we need to look at what's happening in the world right now. There are other minority groups that are being discriminated against. And there's something that's happening related to the internet, something that's happening related to our political dialogue and the way that people treat each other generally in high public places and the way that they talk to each other with a lack of civility, and where it's become almost acceptable to demean people and to treat people with less than their human dignity. And I wanted to ask each of you to just tell me what you think is happening in the world today that we are seeing these rises happen. What are the factors that are contributing to this uptick in hate crimes? Certainly for Jews, certainly, but throughout our societies, throughout the world today. What's happening? Is it the internet? Is it that the people that were underground before, it's easier for them to express themselves utilizing social media? Is it because of leadership in the world? Is it because people feel threatened because of their economic circumstances? What is it that's happening in the world today that we see this uptick in anti-Semitism and other discrimination? Mr. Goldenberg?
Well, one of the things, and my distinguished colleagues could probably really elaborate more so on what I'm going to say, but I'm not looking to simplify it. But when I had the honor of working closely when you were county executive, I'm very aware of the good work you did out in the county on bias crimes and hate crimes.
Thank you.
Working with your police department. And as someone that actually was responsible for the prosecution and an investigation of these crimes at the state of New Jersey for the Attorney General's office, I'm speaking again through a different set of optics. Back in the day when we were investigating these types of crimes and we had leaflets calling for death to the Jews or Jews to the ovens, which are extremely heinous in itself. Those words were leafleted at maybe 100 cars, and those that were distributing the leaflets would get tired and go back to their basements and go back to their disheveled printers. And I'm not making light of this by no means. Today, Congressman, with a single click of a finger, you can reach tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, some of which are now much more emboldened. They feed off of each other. You know, but the old cliche, some say, well, you know, the internet, First Amendment, sticks and stones will break your bones, but there are statistics to show that dozens and dozens and dozens of individuals who have been involved or engaged or have perpetrated murders tied to extremist views have done so because they were inspired through the internet. Stormfront, one of the most vile internet sites out there. Breivik in Norway, who killed dozens of children. Miller, who shot 3 wonderful human beings out in Kansas City. And our latest individual that just was found guilty for shooting nine wonderful souls down, taking out 9 wonderful souls in Charleston, South Carolina. The common denominator between them is they visited the same site. They visited the same site. So it's the old cliche, it's the best of times and the worst of times because we have this wonderful tool.
Yeah.
But again, my colleagues can elaborate much more.
That's the point that Tom Friedman makes in his recent book, Thank You for Being Late, is that, you know, the internet makes this opportunity for makers to do great things and for breakers, the people that want to try and take us down.
Well, you ask a real challenging question because there is an uptick, and the why is really one I think we all wrestle with. It reminded me of something that goes back now, I think, almost 25 years. AJC at the time was doing attitude surveys in different European countries. We would ask how people felt about Jews as neighbors and so on, but about other minority groups too, to really try to get a more comprehensive picture, not only of anti-Semitism, but other prejudice and so on. And we were presenting them, I recall, one of these surveys done in Germany at a press conference in Berlin. And it was a pretty significant degree of anti-Jewish, but also anti-other group sentiments. I want to say ranging maybe from 20% up to maybe 80% in terms of the degree of negativity, depending on the group. And someone asked about such surveys at the time in the United States, and there have been. And what was interesting was the range of negative attitudes, the range itself was much lower. You know, maybe beginning at 5 or 6% and maybe going up in the worst case to 20+%, depending on the group. And one of the Germans in this conference said, well, you know, maybe as a way of explaining the more negative responses there, maybe people here are just, they're just more willing to give speak their mind, to tell you what they really feel, and that perhaps those surveys done in America, people were inhibited. They didn't want to say what they really felt. And it seemed like an answer, although at the time my colleague said, well, you know, maybe that's true. But the first step, at the very least, is to make saying those things taboo. Even if you think it, you shouldn't feel free to say it. And it's always struck me, it's a basic lesson. It goes whether it's the old way of communicating in broadsides or just public speeches, or in the new means we have today, but it comes back to the same thing. We need to, at the first step at least, make sure these kinds of racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic expressions aren't acceptable. And we all have a role in doing that.
That's an excellent point, Rabbi. Thank you.
I agree with what both my distinguished colleagues have said before, and I would say that just to make it very graphic, when I remember one of the first articles I wrote about extremism on the internet was for a conference at Oxford, I think in the year 2000, and I entitled it, "The Internet is More Powerful Than a Sword." And that was actually the message at that point that was taken from the writings of neo-Nazi online. They themselves saw it as more powerful. Actually, if we begin and want to take an understanding of this, Stormfront, which Paul mentioned, is basically credited with being the original neo-Nazi site online from 1995. Actually, the reality is already in the mid-'80s, in the old dial-up BBS systems, we found a neo-Nazi site from West Virginia, for example, was one of the first online, and it became the prototype. It had a library of neo-Nazi writings. It had a list of race traitors, things of that effect on it. Point systems where people were already targeted, ranging from leaders of civil rights organizations, federal judges, Jewish leaders, et cetera, it was already an established theme by the turn of the millennium. So this has been prevalent ever since the technology began. And it teaches us that it's not the technology, it's the human beings involved with it. So what my colleague said, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that the sense of responsibility is something that is lacking. And I would also say, and add to it, that I think one of the things that we allowed, and you made the point of political language becoming debased and very highly charged. Chairman Smith has referred to Natan Sharansky's remarks a couple of times already. I think what he was pointing out and talking about was how the criticism to Israel became hostility to Israel. Israel became identified and accepted as identification in certain elite circles, media circles, and so on, identified with Nazi acts, with an apartheid state, with an illegal state, with genocide, with concentration camps. And this was then extended to the totality of the Jewish people. The effects of the Holocaust were turned around, were inverted, where the victims became the perpetrators. So we have a system or a culture where in certain ways very highly emotionally charged language was used to create not just disagreement, but hate. And stereotypes were built into it. The opposition that Rabbi Baker mentioned to some of the traditional acts of Jewish religious practice, some of which were aimed, by the way, and I heard it firsthand from parliamentarians in Norway, for example, that these acts were aimed originally at the Muslim community there, and Jews were collateral damage that went along with it. But they reverted back to traditional stereotypes of Jews as blood-sucking, vampiric figures. And these were in mainstream newspapers. So we saw it entering the mainstream of society, and I think in essence what we're talking about is that anti-Semitism used to be marginalized. We used to think of it as the extremes. What we've seen in recent years is through political anti-Semitism and now through Holocaust distortion and other means, it has entered the mainstream of society with the effects that we see today where Jews throughout the world, particularly in the Western world, feel imperiled in ways that are really, frankly, unparalleled in recent memory. So I think the leadership question is major. I think the sense of responsibility in terms of political speech in general, anti-Semitism in particular, is very important. But I think the leadership as shown by the actions of this committee and yourself pave a way and a model that we hope more people will emulate.
Thank you.
So the question you ask is so perplexing because every public attitude survey that we see about our own country, you can look in Germany at a similar trend. The American people, the German people, people in communities are growing more tolerant of each other. More people in America today have favorable views of Jewish people than they have before, and that's true of other groups as well. But the hatred has such a microphone right now. It's hard to hear that tolerance. And I think, my colleagues have touched on a point. The internet is anonymous. Think about what it took to bring down the Klan. It's not that the people in Claverns believed our arguments that their values were, not as good as ours. It's because they had to take off their hoods and show their faces, stand behind that hatred. And our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, keeps reminding us that the people who used to burn crosses on front lawns are now burning up Twitter. And so my colleagues are right, it's just another platform for the same thing. There's anger, there's a vacuum of leadership, and we are all of us on both sides of this table, we're in a battle for an evidence and a decency-based marketplace of ideas. And it goes from the global level to a very personal level. If you shoot hoops in the congressional gym with someone from the other party, you're less likely to believe it the next time one of your colleagues tells you that that guy's group is out to get you or your agenda. I say guy because we're in the gym in this scenario.
There's women in the gym, too.
It could be, oh, okay.
I worked out with some Republican women and men today.
Good for you. That's all politics is local, as you know from being a county executive. So your statements today, our visible partnership, communities see that. And when we can sit here as nobodies at a table and bring our expertise and give you a list of our ideas, and know that this chairman is quite likely to take all of the ideas and turn them into action and then some, that's a very powerful example for people to see.
Thank you very much.
We're on the way.
That image you gave of the idea of taking the hoods off of Klans members is a very good image, which is, transparency and exposing things. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that goes with all different things in government, but certainly on this issue, exposing the people that are behind these actions and talking about it publicly is so important, and that's why it's so important that the chairman held this hearing today and that all of you came. So thank you again.
Yeah, it just, and Mark, I think you stirred this a little bit. One of the things we did find in working across 10 countries, Andy and I traveled probably even more than that, and as well as Stacy and I, synagogues and Jewish centers in Europe have become lightning rods for what happens geopolitically. And that should not be the case. These synagogues, these precious, they're more than infrastructure. In some cases, 100 years old. In some cases, it could be 10 years old. These are the fabric of the nations where they sit. They're part of their fabric. And I think that is something that we cannot allow this continuum, even amongst the police ranks, to believe in some of these countries that if they're attacking a synagogue, it's got to do or associated with what's happening geopolitically 2,000-3,000 miles away, because that's not the case. What's happening geopolitically 2,000-3,000 miles away is happening 2,000-3,000 miles away. But there are those that will use that as an excuse. We have to keep reminding people, including the security services, the national security services, these are your houses. These are your institutions. These are your synagogues. These are your schools and your Jewish centers. And they need the same protection. They belong to you. And that's something that our collective groups are working on right now. More than a reminder, but that's about training. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just add, before yielding to Mr. Sherman, that was the exact point that Natan Sharansky was making with his 3 Ds: demonization of Israel, delegitimization, and double standard. And nowhere is that more rampant than at the United Nations, particularly the Human Rights Council, which is why, as I said in my opening, our new ambassador to the UN, has really drawn a line, has a zero-tolerance attitude towards that pernicious hypocrisy, which is rampant. I've gone to the Human Rights Council myself several times, and before that, when it was called the Human Rights Commission, and was appalled to see countries with whom I have Western democracies, all of us have great respect for. They have matured, to use the word that was used earlier, democratic traditions, just joining in the parade in bashing Israel unjustly. And then that reverberates back to the attack on the synagogue, because it riles people up, and now with, as was pointed out, with a click of the button, people get this misinformation, this hate, and then they act on it. So thank you for all of those comments. Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me participate in this hearing, although as a member of the full committee, I'm not a member of this subcommittee. And I want to commend you for being the author of the Global Anti-Semitism Review Act of 2004 that established the Special Envoy on global anti-Semitism.
If the gentleman would yield, I was the House sponsor, Voinovich was the Senate sponsor, but when his bill came over, which called for a one-year review, I offered the amendment to make it a permanent office and then also to establish the special envoy that Ira so faithfully led for several years.
Yes, and I also have a personal connection to that office since my wife was the first deputy special envoy, and I take family pride in her work on the report on global anti-Semitism issued by the State Department in March of 2008. And my first question for our panel is, we did write that report. It's almost 10 years ago. Do we, I'm not saying we can write one every year, but should we be writing one every decade? Do we need another report on contemporary global anti-Semitism? Yes, Ms. Bird.
It's always a good idea to highlight issues and do special reports. If you look at the annual country reports on human rights and international religious freedom, you will see that Ira Foreman and the team that is still working every day in the State Department do not get much sleep before those reports are due. And what you have done to require these good public servants to ask every single embassy in the world to report on anti-Semitism, when you pull that together, it is a terrific snapshot. Your legislation was game-changing, and we have eyes on the problem in places we never did. Every 10 years, it would be very, very wise to do a similar kind of report. And I know Mrs. Sherman's expertise was absolutely essential to that successful report, and you're wise to be very proud of her.
Thank you. One thing that report does is it defines anti-Semitism, basing its definition in large part on the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia's working definition of anti-Semitism. And defining anti-Semitism is important, especially in dealing with what I'd have to describe as far left-wing or misguided left-wing anti-Semitism. On the extreme right, you see references to Nazis. It's pretty obvious that it's anti-Semitic. But you also see attacks on the Jewish people where the where the attacker defends and says, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, just anti-Zionist." And there needs to be a definition that distinguishes between legitimate criticism of the government of Israel, something most members of this panel have engaged in from time to time, and a holding Israel up to a standard that no other country is held to, or claiming that of all the countries in the world and all that this is the one country that should be abolished. What I wonder, though, is that the U.S. Department of Education doesn't have a definition of anti-Semitism, has not yet adopted the State Department definition. Does it undermine us in talking to other countries about anti-Semitism in their country that we are defining anti-Semitism by a standard that we don't apply here domestically? Rabbi?
I think it's a quite pertinent question, and I would sort of turn around and say our ability to be a strong advocate in pressing governments, as we are, to employ the working definition, whether it's in police training, whether it's in training judges and prosecutors, whether it's in monitoring anti-Semitism, would certainly be enhanced if we can cite our own example in the United States of putting it to use. I think we all would hold the view, I know my organization does, when this issue first came up in the last Congress, that this working definition is a very useful educational tool. If it's a useful educational tool for the Justice Ministry of Austria, I'd say it's a useful educational tool for the Department of Education here, which is concerned about monitoring and addressing problems of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And if I could also speak to your first question, a U.S. global report about anti-Semitism, even if it has the same information, and by the way, it's increasingly having much more, I think, we know what's gathered, but even if it has the same information as our own Jewish organizations might report, has an impact that's unparalleled in getting government's attention. So having that report really allows us and everyone else to go in and to push these governments who are now taking notice. And finally, it has also educated, let's be candid, our own American diplomats. As embassies have a responsibility to monitor what's going on, they're becoming more sensitive to what this is about. And again, in these places, that definition is a very helpful tool.
It's been my experience in Congress that one of the best ways to affect what people do is to ask them the right question. And by asking all of our embassies on a continuing basis to ask their host governments, what are they doing about anti-Semitism, you drive policy in the right direction. Mr. Weitzman.
So I would just like to add as well that, as you know, the 31 member nations of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance officially adopted the variation of the working definition of anti-Semitism. And in the negotiations and conversations with the countries leading up to that, its adoption, and my colleague, Dr. Robert Williams from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, was instrumental in assisting in this process as well. We found very often the question raised of what is the United States' position on this. We were able to refer to the State Department website and the document on the website, but that obviously only dealt with external and multilateral relationships. It didn't deal with the domestic case at all. So having this definition through the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that is now being held up in Congress, we think would be very powerful and very strong and send a message not only to domestic constituents in the United States in terms of the people on campus, even clarifying it for the administrators. It's a tool for the administrators and the people dealing with this issue on campus, as well as for the protection of students. But it also sends a message externally as well to other countries that we are basically putting into practice what we are preaching. That our moral voice and political leadership is strong on this issue, and we feel it applies as well to the United States.
And I think it undercuts our foreign policy across the board when people can point to an example where we have a standard to hold other countries to, and we refuse to oppose that standard on ourselves. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would be, I strongly support it, but frankly, it shouldn't take that. The Department of Education has a responsibility to enforce Title VI. I've worked with that department over the last 10 years, and we got a clear statement that Title VI applies to anti-Semitism, although the statute says national origin and race, that clearly applies to the Jewish people as well, and to bigotry against Muslims as well. And it is, if the Department of Education has determined that it has a responsibility to deal with anti-Semitism on campuses, it has a responsibility to have a definition of anti-Semitism. And one would wonder why they wouldn't adopt the same definition that has been adopted by so many organizations, with a tweak here, with a tweak there, and especially why they wouldn't adopt the same definition of anti-Semitism that the State Department uses for our foreign policy. I want to shift to Hungary. I'd like to know more about this, and I'm going to mispronounce it, Viteci Rend. It's my understanding that there are two rival organizations using the same name. Is there any doubt that this organization is an anti-Semitic organization? I'll ask this to Rabbi Baker, and then see if anyone else has a comment.
You know, this is an organization sort of reconstituted from a pre-war organization that was certainly anti-Semitic, fascist, part of the supporters, followers of Admiral Horthy, and
a pro-Nazi organization during World War II.
exactly that. So I don't know that it has much influence today in Hungary, but the reality is this is its origin, and it was around this sentiment, these ideological views, clearly anti-Semitic, that it was reformed. So I guess a clear answer would be
I mean,
yes.
if somebody formed an organization called the Nazi Party of California, they may not publish a manifesto that is anti-Semitic. They don't need to. They name themselves the Nazi Party of California, and they have associated themselves with the Nazi Party of Germany as and the role it played in world history. So we don't have to wait for today's Venetzi Wren to publish a anti-Semitic manifesto. They've named themselves after or claim to be a continuation of an organization that was the pro-Nazi organization in Hungary in the 30s and 40s.
I think they knew what they were doing when they chose their name. So, you know.
Yeah. Now I'm going to get down in the weeds on this, and this may not. I'm told that members of this organization add a V as an additional middle initial to show their support for the organization. Are you aware of that practice?
I am not, but
Okay.
maybe others.
Gotcha. Want to thank you for your work. Thank the chairman for holding these hearings, and yield back.
Thank you. Just a few following questions, and thank you for your your time, and again for elaborating so well on your responses to the questions. Ms. Burdett, you made a very important, I think, observation about Latin America, which you might want to elaborate on. You point out that in Latin America over the last few years, there has been a region-wide increase in anti-Semitic expressions and attacks directed at Jewish individuals and institutions, primarily via the internet and social media. You point out that Venezuela continues to be a country where state-sponsored or state-endorsed, your word, anti-Semitism is systematic and affects government policies every day for life for Jews. Argentina, where the Jewish community has been the target of the infamous anti-Jewish terrorist attacks, and I did visit that community center myself and was just struck by the ongoing brokenheartedness by those who run that center, and the fact that the Iranian perpetrator of those crimes, the alleged, but I think the evidence is very clear, continues to be not held to account. And then you point out that smaller countries like Costa Rica and Uruguay, where anti-Semitism was practically negligible, are now facing new challenges. And you give an example in Uruguay where a Jewish businessman was stabbed to death by a man who said that he killed a Jew following Allah's order. You point out that your cyber safety action guide has now been translated into Spanish for dissemination there. But if you could speak to some of this, and maybe on Iran's influence. You know, not to get into, relitigate at this hearing, the Iranian nuclear deal, which I think was egregiously flawed, and you don't have to comment on any of that, but I think it's a matter of when and not if that Iran gets nuclear weapons pursuant to those huge gaps in that legislation or in that agreement. But that said, they're getting a boatload of money. They've already gotten billions of dollars. They'll get more. And that helps Hezbollah. That helps a whole lot of people. But we know that Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and they certainly are anti-Semitic to the core. And their influence in Latin America. I was in Bolivia a few years ago trying to get a Jewish businessman out of prison, Jacob Ostreicher, and had 4 hearings on his case alone. Went down there. Our embassy wasn't doing squat at first. They did get further involved. I went to the Palomasaro prison where he was, but the anti-Semitic view of Evo Morales and the others is palatable. And I add to that their affection for Iran is equally disturbing. So, Iran's influence in Latin America, Venezuela, we know they're close, Argentina, again, has this ongoing festering sore. So if you could speak to it.
Well, I want to first say that the fact that this body has refused to let go of the questions around this investigation. I know there's a resolution circulating in the House, and I know your colleague from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, who was here earlier, has been very active and engaged in this issue and looking at the Iranian connection. Our organizations, too, thought that the JCPOA with Iran wasn't strong enough, wasn't ironclad enough. And I think a number of the incidents that we're dealing with in the community are a result of this infectious influence. And we know that Iran practically has anti-Semitism and the export of anti-Semitism as a policy. And so when the supreme leader calls Israel a cancerous tumor, or when their Ministry of Culture endorses a Holocaust cartoon contest, that crosses every border. And we support your efforts to shed more light on that investigation and to infuse that investigation with our assistance to expose that connection. So I think from a governmental side, you are doing your part, and as advocates, we are spotlighting the permeation across borders of the hate that makes those incidents possible.
If I could, to Rabbi Baker, in your written testimony, and I appreciate your leadership on this, you point out that the chair in office, Steinmeier, had tried to get the definition of anti-Semitism adopted. Only one country, Russia, blocked it. And just for the record, I have it here, but perhaps without objection, I will put into the record that definition. It's very short, but also the State Department's elaboration on it, which I think gives it additional understanding. Will a new attempt be made within the OSCE to get that definition, adopted across all countries, including Russia? And if you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
I really hope so. Look, I think there's no question that the kind of leadership that the German foreign minister showed was unique, and the current chair, I believe, is open if we're able to show that there could be a consensus to bring it up at the ministerial this December in Vienna. I think the support from members here, Chairman Smith, and those who are part of the Helsinki Commission will also be important for this. We need to find ways to bring Russia around on this issue. As I've noted in the past and in conversations with you, when I met with them and they explained to me they had two problems with that adoption of the definition. One concerned the views they said of their own Jewish experts, who they claimed opposed it, which really was not true. Another was the fact that it referenced the IRA definition, and they said they were not members of IRA. I said to them, well, so are those the only two problems? And they replied, well, for now. So we know that it's not so much addressing them as legitimate reasons, but finding the ability to be able to say there are not just for now, but permanently, no objections. Maybe we can tweak the actual language to provide something that would be suitable. But if we can, and we will try to secure Russian support for this, or at least non-opposition, then I very much hope it could come back and perhaps succeed in December.
One final question for me, and then I'll yield to my colleague if he has any additional ones. The obviously, the Security Council Resolution 2334 was a disaster, in my opinion. It also had embedded in it language that I think is very injurious to, or could give amplification to the BDS movement, and perhaps, Mr. Weissman, you might want to speak to that. I've met with Prince Zayed, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I am beyond troubled, angered, as I believe, and I know you are, that compiling lists of companies that the UN High Commissioner has taken upon himself to do is a very, very dangerous precedent, somehow suggesting the illegitimacy of Israel and East Jerusalem being one and the same. There's, any final determination between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as we all have said 1,000 times, needs to be negotiated between the two entities. To have this increasingly imposition of a outcome dictated by the United Nations and its bureaucracy is troubling. But when there's also an economic threat posed by BDS, that raises an even further, and that will have more impact, in my opinion, in Europe than it will here, although it will impact us here as well, as those companies are listed that do business in areas that are in contention with the United Nations. And maybe if you could just elaborate too on, there's right-wing and there's left-wing strong manifestations of anti-Semitism. We see it. I guess what came out of Rabbi Baker to me in those very early meetings in Vienna and then Berlin and then follow-up meetings was the hatred from the left and the right. I remember when we were pushing Holocaust remembrance in France, it was the teachers' union and the leftists who were most adamantly opposed to any kind of teaching of students of the Holocaust. So the left and the right has shame on its face, in my opinion, the extreme left and the extreme right. But BDS is also something that the left is pushing. Maybe you might want to speak to that as well.
Thank you. In regards to the United Nations, I think one of the things that we've seen, really the vigorous pushback by Ambassador Haley and leading the U.S. delegation to make it very clear that we will not tolerate crossing a certain line of what is really acceptable political discourse and what is not. And we were very encouraged by the reaction of the Secretary General in not only rejecting the flawed report that came out that linked Israel to apartheid practices, but actually taking it off and taking it down from the UN website, which already actually caused at least one diplomat to resign and protest over it. But it was really unprecedented, and we're very cheered that the Secretary General took a strong step on that, and we hope that that's showing a little bit of a shift back to a more rational and decent approach by the UN. I think in terms of BDS, one of the things that we've seen is that, again, a number of states in the United States, as well as a number of cities, have passed laws against BDS recently, over the past year or so, which are something that I think will strengthen the backbone, even though it wasn't necessarily, I think a lot of the cases that this was not necessarily a practical step as much of an expression of political will and an expression of common belief that BDS is not only against Israel and not only anti-Semitic, but is fundamentally un-American. It challenges freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and as such, I think most Americans would reject it instinctively. What happens in Europe, again, I think the United States can play a very strong role in positioning itself as a leader against BDS, and in making sure that, given the prominence of the U.S. Industries, that it fails, as it's failed in so many other places. I will say in terms of right-wing and left-wing extremism, one of the points that I would like to just make briefly is that there's been a sea change in right-wing extremism in the United States over the past generation or so. People had referred to the Klan, and if you look back at Klan history and documents, they originally came about, and up until even through the 1960s in the Civil Rights period, they claimed fealty to a vision, a flawed and totally historically inaccurate but idealized vision of the United States as a sort of antebellum Southern vision of a place where slavery and religious persecution were embedded in the Constitution and thus were American ideals. The generation that we have, starting in the later part of the 20th century, is a generation of extremists who see themselves at war with the United States. They consider the U.S. government Zionist-occupied government territory, and that's one of the reasons why they're so ready to go into violent acts, because to them a state of war already exists with the Jews who control the U.S. government and people down to postal offices who have been murdered because they wore the government uniform. That has then translated it into the rhetoric that we see sometimes on the extremes of the alt-right and so on, who consider themselves at war with established political institutions and political norms in the U.S. And I think that's one of the things that we have to recognize, the shift between the traditional extremism and the new status that we have now. And of course, again, the left-wing extremism is very often filtered through traditional, going back to the communist opposition to Israel, to opposition to Jews as a distinct religion, both of which were fundamentally opposed by communism, and even the erasure of Jews from history, as the infamous plaque at Babi Yar under communists basically talked about the victims of fascism in a generic sense at Auschwitz as well, taking away and erasing the specificity of the Jewish experience in that period.
Just to be very brief, I think, look, one of the phenomena of anti-Semitism is that it can link haters from all across the spectrum who literally have nothing else in common. I mean, it almost defies any rational understanding. So, yeah, we've come to see and expect it's part of a right-wing xenophobic ideology. It's traditionally been there in Europe, and almost all of these nationalist parties, anti-Semitism is a piece of it. You know, at the same time, and again, I reference having been relatively recently in Sweden, you have now a growth that was pointed out to us of these, in many cases, they're minority groups, hip-hop, rap artists, engaged in concerts to combat racism that use overtly anti-Semitic language in their lyrics. So how do you square this? I mean, the fact is, it is a phenomenon we're seeing not only, as Mark has indicated, from maybe the historical notion of what communism or socialist movements may have done, but even in what would almost be a kind of post-movement Europe today, where still figures on the left, they may be literary figures, musical figures, or others, have folded in this. Again, it may start as anti-Zionism, but it often comes full-blown as an anti-Semitism with all those negative stereotypes of Jews. It's there.
That concludes the hearing. I want to thank you again for your extraordinary leadership, each of you, and for giving us the benefit as a subcommittee and by extension the Congress, because we will share this widely with the leadership and especially your testimonies today. And as the record is obviously produced, we'll get that out to key policymakers as well, because again, you have provided a treasure trove of insight and expectation, as well as the experience and past is prologue. We need to learn from the past and also face these new challenges as they emerge. So thank you so very, very much. The hearing is adjourned.